The dust of the Texas Panhandle tasted of failure. It was a fine, red grit that coated Annabeth's tongue, settled in the folds of her tattered wedding dress, and stung her eyes, blurring the endless horizon into a wavering line of heat and sorrow. The wind, a constant, lonely presence on the plains, whipped loose strands of her honey-blonde hair across her face, catching in her lashes. It was a merciless wind, one that seemed to take pleasure in peeling back the layers of a person until all that was left was the raw, aching truth of them. For Annabeth, that truth was etched onto the left side of her face. Her hand, as if with a will of its own, rose to trace the familiar, jagged landscape of her cheek. The skin was a tapestry of ruin, pulled tight and puckered from her temple down to her jawline, a permanent reminder of the day her world had turned to ash. The simple white dress, meant to be a symbol of a new beginning, now felt like a shroud. It was torn at the hem from stumbling over rock and sagebrush, stained with the red earth she had knelt upon when the final, crushing weight of her reality had brought her to her knees. She had been left at the altar, not by a man who had found another, or one who had simply lost his nerve, but by a man who, in front of God and the entire congregation of their small Ohio town, had looked at her scar and found he could not look past it. The wind's sharp caress against her cheek was a cruel reminder of a different kind of touch, the searing kiss of flame. The memory was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to surge forth with the slightest provocation. It had been a winter night 5 years ago. The smell wasn't of dust and dry grass, but of pine logs crackling in the hearth, of her mother's baking, and the faint, sweet scent of the oil in the lamps. She had been reading by the fire, her father dozing in his armchair, her mother humming softly in the kitchen. Then came the crash. A lantern overturned, a pool of burning oil spreading across the wooden floorboards like a malevolent, living thing. It was an orange beast, roaring and insatiable. Her father's shout, her mother's scream, the suffocating black smoke that filled her lungs. She remembered her father pushing her toward the window, his hands strong on her back. "Go, Annie, get out!" The last thing she saw of him was his silhouette against the rising inferno as he turned back for her mother. She had scrambled out, landing hard in the snow, and turned back to the house just as a falling beam struck the wall beside her. The searing pain on her face was instant, a blinding white heat that stole her breath and her consciousness. When she woke, her world was gone. Her parents were gone. The face she had known her whole life was gone. In its place was this ruin. The town that had once pitied her for her loss soon began to shun her for her appearance. Whispers followed her like shadows. Children would sometimes point, their curiosity unblunted by tact. Women would avert their eyes. Men, who had once smiled at her, now looked away, their discomfort a palpable thing. She was a living ghost, a reminder of tragedy that people preferred to forget. Samuel had been her only hope. He had courted her before the fire, and to his credit, he had stayed. He had promised her that the scar didn't matter, that he loved the woman beneath it. Annabeth, desperate to believe in something good again, had allowed herself to hope. She had poured every last ounce of her fractured spirit into that hope, stitching it into the seams of her wedding dress. But when the day came, and she stood before him, the veil lifted, the full extent of her disfigurement laid bare in the unforgiving light of the church. She saw the truth in his eyes. It wasn't hatred, it was worse. It was revulsion. A flicker of it, quickly masked, but she had seen it, his words. "I cannot," were not a shout, but a whisper, and that whisper had shattered what little remained of her world. So she had run. With the few dollars she had saved, she had walked away from the church, away from the stunned silence and the pitying stares, and bought a ticket for the first transport heading west, which brought her here, to this desolate stagecoach stop, waiting for the final coach of the day. It was headed to a place she'd only seen on a map, a speck of a town called Larkspur Hollow. The name sounded hopeful, like a flower blooming in a sheltered place. She held no illusions of finding beauty there, only anonymity. Her plan was simple and bleak. Find work as a scullery maid, a laundress, a cleaner, anything that would allow her to earn her keep and remain unseen. She would be a shadow, and in the shadows, no one could be repulsed by what they could not see. The stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust and a jingle of harnesses. Annabeth climbed aboard, her head bowed, pulling the brim of her worn bonnet low over the left side of her face. The few other passengers, a weary-looking drummer, a stern woman with 2 quiet children, gave her a cursory glance and then looked away, respecting the unspoken code of the trail that discouraged idle curiosity. Hours later, they rumbled into Larkspur Hollow. It was hardly more than a single dusty main street flanked by a dozen or so wooden buildings with false fronts. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and at the far end, a 2-story building with a faded sign that read, Gable's Boarding House, clean beds and hot meals. As Annabeth stepped down, clutching her small carpet bag, she felt the familiar prickle of eyes on her, the town's inhabitants, idling on porches and in doorways. Paused to watch the new arrival. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, her bonnet her shield, but she could feel their stares, some curious, some suspicious, and a few, she thought, tinged not with disgust, but with a weary sort of pity. She walked purposefully to the boarding house and knocked on the door. It was opened by a woman who looked as weathered as the town itself. She was old, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hair pulled back in a severe gray bun. Her eyes, however, were sharp and missed nothing. "What do you want?" the woman asked, her voice gravelly. I'm looking for work, ma'am," Annabeth said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can cook, clean, do laundry. I'm a hard worker." The old woman's gaze swept over Annabeth, lingering for a moment on the shadowed side of her face before meeting her eyes again. There was no flicker of surprise, only a deep, abiding tiredness. "Name's Martha Gable. I own this place," she grunted. "Lord knows I could use the help. The last girl ran off with a silver-tongued card sharp." She opened the door wider. "Work is work, girl. Long as you can do it. I don't care if you've got 2 heads. You start tomorrow at sunrise. Room and board, plus $2 a week. Now go fetch some water from the river before the sun's down completely. Buckets are out back." Relief, so potent it almost made her dizzy, washed over Annabeth. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and made her way around the back of the boarding house. She found 2 heavy wooden buckets and began the short walk towards the gentle slope that led down to the river. The water was cool and clear, a welcome respite from the oppressive dust. As she dipped the first bucket, a sound made her look up. A man was there, not 20 yards away, securing his horse to a hitching post near a cottonwood tree. He was tall, with shoulders that spoke of a life of hard labor. He wore dusty jeans, worn leather chaps, and a faded blue shirt. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing dark, unruly hair. There was a stillness about him, a quiet solitude that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a blacksmith's forge. He finished with his horse and turned, his eyes meeting hers across the short distance. He gave a slow, polite nod. Annabeth, flustered, nodded back, instinctively turning her head so her good side faced him. But it was too late. He had already seen her. She braced herself for the inevitable reaction. He started walking towards the boarding house, his path taking him right past her. Annabeth focused on filling the second bucket, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear his footsteps, steady and unhurried, on the dry earth. "Evening, ma'am," he said as he drew level with her. His voice was low and calm, like the river beside them. "Sir," she managed to reply, not looking up. She expected him to keep walking, to hurry past her, but his footsteps paused. She could feel his gaze on her and held her breath. He was looking. She knew he was looking directly at the scar. She waited for the sharp intake of breath, the muttered word, the quickened pace as he moved away. None of it came. There was only a moment of silence, a space filled by the chirping of crickets and the gentle murmur of the river. When she finally risked a glance up, his expression was unreadable. There was no shock, no pity, no revulsion, nothing. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady, as if he were merely noting the color of the sky. It was the nothing that undid her. She had built fortifications against cruelty and pity, but she had no defense against this quiet, unnerving acceptance. She was the one who felt the blush of shame creep up her neck. She was the one who broke eye contact first, fumbling with the heavy buckets. He gave another slight nod, touched the brim of his hat, and continued on his way to the boarding house without another word. Annabeth stood there for a long moment, the water sloshing at her feet, her mind reeling. She had been seen, fully and completely, and the world had not ended. The man had not recoiled. It was a reaction so alien to her experience that it left her feeling more exposed and vulnerable than any cruel taunt ever had. Later that evening, after her meager supper, she sat on a rocking chair on the boarding house's long front porch. The town had settled into a quiet rhythm. Lamplight glowed in the windows, and the tinny sound of a piano drifted from the saloon. Above, the sky was a vast expanse of dark velvet, littered with a careless spill of brilliant stars. A silver-dollar moon hung low, bathing the dusty street in a pale, ethereal light. Annabeth gently touched her cheek. The skin was rough, insensitive to her own touch, yet it dictated her entire existence. The cowboy's non-reaction played over and over in her mind. It wasn't kindness, she told herself. It was indifference. He simply hadn't cared, and perhaps that was the best she could hope for. She looked out at the dark, sprawling land that stretched out before her, so immense and empty. Was this it? Was this her life now? To work until her hands were raw and her back ached, to hide her face from the world, to be grateful for mere indifference? She thought of the love she had dreamed of, the children she had hoped for, the life that had burned down with her family home. A cold, heavy despair settled in her chest. She looked up at the impassive moon and asked the silent, empty darkness a question she had been too afraid to voice until now. Was a life half-lived, in the shadows, still a life worth living? The prairie wind offered no answer. The days at Gable's boarding house bled into one another, each marked by the same rhythm of relentless work. Annabeth rose before the sun, her first task to stoke the embers in the great kitchen stove. Her world became a rotation of lye soap, boiling water, dirty linen, and the endless scrubbing of wooden floors until her hands were raw and her back a constant, dull ache. She moved through the boarding house like a phantom, a creature of the early morning and late-night shadows. It was a hard life, but it was an anonymous one, and for that she was grateful. She learned the art of invisibility. She kept her head down, her bonnet pulled low when she had to venture outside. She spoke only when necessary, her voice soft and infrequent. The boarders were mostly transient men, ranch hands, prospectors, drummers, and they paid her little mind. They saw a quiet, efficient servant, and that was all she wanted them to see. Mrs. Gable was a fair, if not warm, employer. She worked Annabeth to the bone, but ensured she was fed and left alone. A silent pact of mutual utility. The quiet cowboy from her first day, the one whose steady gaze had so unnerved her, became a semi-regular presence. Annabeth learned his name was Elias. He would ride in from the east every 10 days or so, his horse a fine, dark bay that moved with a powerful grace. Unlike the other men who took cheap beds in the communal bunkhouse, Elias always paid for a private room. He would eat his dinner quietly in the corner of the common room, nurse a single cup of coffee, and then retire. Their interactions were limited to polite, almost imperceptible nods. He never stared at her, never tried to engage her in conversation. His quiet presence was simply a fact, like the creak of the floorboards or the whistle of the wind through the eaves. And she slowly grew accustomed to it. She began to see his solitude not as a judgment on her, but as a reflection of his own nature. Summer bled into the harsher temperament of early autumn. The sky, once a placid, endless blue, now bruised easily with the threat of storms. The wind was no longer a steady whisper, but a restless thing that clawed at the buildings and sent dust devils dancing down the main street. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the violent release of the seasonal squalls that would sweep across the plains with biblical fury. One afternoon, such a storm descended upon Larkspur Hollow with breathtaking speed. Annabeth had been outside, gathering laundry from the line, when the sky turned from a hazy yellow to a malevolent slate gray in a matter of minutes. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rose to a shriek. It tore a bedsheet from her grasp and sent it cartwheeling into the sky like a frantic ghost. "Get inside, girl! Mrs.!" Gable yelled from the doorway. Annabeth scrambled to secure the wooden shutters on the downstairs windows, the wind fighting her with a physical force. Dust and grit stung her eyes, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dry ground with audible splats. As she struggled with the last shutter, the heavens opened. It was not a rain, but a deluge, a solid curtain of water that turned the world into a churning, gray blur. The dusty yard transformed instantly into a slick, treacherous sea of red mud. Turning to run for the porch, her worn leather shoe found no purchase. Her feet went out from under her, and she fell hard, her side and hip slamming into the mire. The wind knocked the breath from her lungs, and for a moment, she just lay there, soaked, mud-splattered, and utterly defeated. A pair of strong hands suddenly gripped her arms. "Easy now," a low, calm voice said beside her. She looked up through the rain-plastered strands of her hair to see Elias. He had seemingly appeared from nowhere, his hat pulled low against the torrent. Without effort, he lifted her to her feet, his grip firm and steadying. Annabeth's entire body flushed with a hot, profound shame. To be seen like this, covered in mud, helpless, her face fully exposed to him in the gray light, was a fresh and terrible kind of humiliation. She tried to pull away, to stammer her thanks, but he kept a hold on her arm. "Porch," he said, his voice raised over the roar of the wind. He guided her through the churning mud to the relative shelter of the boarding house's long porch. They stood there under the eaves, dripping and breathing heavily as the storm raged around them. The thunder wasn't a distant rumble. It was a physical crack that shook the floorboards beneath their feet, followed by a low, visceral growl that seemed to roll on forever across the vast, open land. "Came on fast," he said, his gaze fixed on the storm. Annabeth nodded, wiping a muddy hand across her forehead, only succeeding in smearing more grit there. She was acutely aware of his closeness, of the sheer size of him next to her. "Thank you," she said, her voice small. "I was clumsy." "Ground slick as grease," he replied, dismissing her apology. "Even a good horse would have trouble with its footing in this." He nodded toward the stable, where his bay stood, its head low, unimpressed by the weather. "My Titan there. He doesn't much care for the thunder. Puts him on edge." It was the most he had ever said to her, and it was about the weather and horses. It was normal. The normalcy of it was so unexpected it disarmed her. She found her own voice, a little stronger this time. "He's a beautiful animal." "He's got sense," Elias said. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "More than most men I know." They stood in a comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the rain lash the street. The conversation was simple, grounded in the things around them, and for the first time in a very long time, Annabeth didn't feel like a scarred woman talking to a man. She felt like a person, talking to another person, while a storm raged. Later that week, as she was helping Mrs. Gable mend a stack of linens in the kitchen. The older woman spoke without looking up from her needlework.
"Elias Thorne is a good man,"
she said, her voice raspy. The sudden mention of his name startled Annabeth.
"Ma'am?"
"A good, quiet man. Keeps to himself. But he's seen his share of trouble. Mrs. Gable bit off a piece of thread. You know how he lost his wife?" Annabeth shook her head, her fingers stilling on the sheet she was folding.
3 years ago.
It was... Her name was Sarah. They were on a stagecoach coming back from visiting her family in the next county. Outlaws stopped them. It was a botched robbery, a stray bullet. Mrs. Gable sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. Elias was right there beside her, helpless. He brought her back here himself. Hasn't been the same man since... The story settled over Annabeth like a shroud. A quiet, decent man who had watched his wife die in his arms. The knowledge clicked into place, explaining the deep-seated sorrow in his eyes, the self-imposed solitude, the way he moved through the world as if carrying an invisible, crushing weight. Her scar was on the outside, a mark for all the world to see and judge. His was on the inside, hidden deep, but no less painful for it. A strange, unwelcome tendril of kinship curled in her chest. A few days later, Elias approached her as she was sweeping the porch in the late afternoon sun. He waited until she had finished a stroke, not wanting to startle her. "Miss," he began, holding his hat in his hands.
Mr.
"Thorne," she replied, keeping her eyes on the broom. "I have a ranch, a few miles east of here. I raise and break horses." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. "It's quiet work, and lonely. I could use an extra pair of hands, someone reliable, to help with the chores, the cooking, tending to the animals. It's hard work, but the pay is fair. Better than what you're making here. I'd reckon..." Annabeth's sweeping stopped. She looked up at him, truly looked at him for the first time. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke more of sorrow than of laughter. His gaze was direct, and in it, she saw no pity. She saw only a man making a straightforward proposition. Her mind raced. Leave the relative safety of the town? Go and live, isolated, with a man she barely knew? The impropriety of it alone was enough to make her breath catch. People would talk. But then, she thought of what she would be leaving. The endless, back-breaking chores, the averted gazes in the street, the constant, suffocating feeling of being watched and judged. The life she was living wasn't a life at all. It was a penance. Out there, at his ranch, there would be no one to stare. There would be only the sky, the land, the horses, and this quiet, wounded man. It would be a different kind of work, an honest, earth-bound labor. It would be a chance to earn her own way, to be more than just Mrs. Gable's disfigured help. It was a terrifying prospect, and it was also the first glimmer of real hope she had felt since the fire. The hope was so fragile it felt like a pain in her chest. He seemed to sense her turmoil. "You can think on it," he said quietly. "It's an honest offer." She looked past him, to the open plains that rolled away to meet the horizon. It was a vast, intimidating wilderness. It promised hardship and loneliness, but it also promised space. Room to breathe. A place where a person's worth might be measured by the strength of their back and the resolve in their heart, not by the smoothness of their skin. Annabeth took a slow breath, the air thick with the smell of dust and coming twilight. She met his steady gaze, her decision solidifying in the space of a single heartbeat. "I don't need to think on it," she said, her voice clearer and firmer than she had heard it in years. "When do I start?" Elias Thorne's ranch was not a place of gentle beauty. It was tucked into a shallow basin where the rolling plains gave way to the gnarled, rocky knuckles of a barren mountain range. The land was stark, painted in shades of ochre, rust, and pale, sun-bleached green. The wind was the true master of this domain. It was a constant, scouring presence that moaned through the canyons and whistled around the corners of the small, sturdy cabin, carrying the scent of dust and distant pine. It was a place that could break a person, or strip them down to their essential, unyielding core. For Annabeth, it felt like the edge of the world, and yet it was quiet. The silence here was a living thing, deeper and more profound than any she had ever known. It was broken only by the nicker of a horse, the cry of a hawk circling on an updraft, or the rhythmic thud of Elias's axe splitting firewood. In this vast, empty landscape, there were no judging eyes, no whispers that followed her from the general store. The wind did not care about the ruin of her face. The mountains did not flinch from her gaze. For the first time in 5 years, Annabeth felt she could breathe. The cabin was simple, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and straw. Inside, it was a single room, meticulously clean and Spartan. A stone hearth dominated one wall, with a small kitchen area set up beside it. Elias's cot was in one corner, and he had prepared a smaller one for her in the opposite corner. A simple canvas sheet stretched over a wooden frame. There was a privacy screen. A threadbare blanket hung from a rope that he had erected without a word. The gesture was so practical, so thoughtful, that it brought a lump to her throat. Life fell into a new rhythm, one dictated by the sun and the needs of the animals. Elias was a patient teacher. He showed her how to groom a horse until its coat shone like polished mahogany, how to recognize the subtle signs of sickness or distress. He taught her the right way to mend a fence, stretching the wire taut until it hummed with tension, his large, calloused hands guiding hers on the tools. Her hands, already rough from her work at the boarding house, grew tougher still, the skin thickening, the muscles in her arms and back hardening. She felt a pride in this new strength, a satisfaction in the solid, tangible results of her labor. She took over the cooking, finding solace in the simple alchemy of turning flour, water, and salt into fresh bread, baked in a Dutch oven nestled in the coals of the fire. She started a small garden in a patch of earth Elias had tilled for her, coaxing stubborn greens and root vegetables from the dry soil. Each small, green shoot that pushed its way toward the sun felt like a personal victory. They worked together, often in comfortable silence, a language of shared tasks developing between them. He would pass her a hammer without her needing to ask. She would have a cup of hot, black coffee ready for him when he came in from the cold. In the evenings, after the work was done and the simple meal was finished, they would sit on the small porch, watching the sky bleed from orange to purple to an impossible, star-dusted black. Sometimes they talked, but mostly they sat, listening to the night sounds, two solitary figures sharing the vast, empty darkness. It was in these quiet moments that their bond deepened. Annabeth learned the contours of his silence, the way it shifted from a weary sadness to a quiet contentment. She saw him one afternoon with a newborn foal, his large hands impossibly gentle as he stroked the trembling creature, his low voice a soothing rumble. She saw him laugh, a rare and startling sound, when a mischievous mare managed to steal his hat right off his head. The laugh was rusty, as if from disuse, but it transformed his face, erasing the years of sorrow for a fleeting moment. He never, ever mentioned her scar. He never shied away from meeting her gaze, never treated her as though she were fragile or broken. But sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch him watching her. It wasn't the look of pity she was so used to. It was a look of deep, profound empathy, a quiet understanding that seemed to see right past the puckered skin and into the wounded heart beneath. It was the look of a man who knew what it was to lose everything. This look unsettled her more than any overture would have. It felt too intimate, too knowing. Her defenses, so carefully constructed, began to feel flimsy under that gentle gaze. A part of her, a part she had thought long dead, began to stir with a dangerous, treacherous hope, but she fought it down ruthlessly. He was a good man, a kind man. He had given her a refuge when she had none. She told herself his kindness was born of pity for a fellow sufferer. He was lonely, and she was useful. It was a simple arrangement, and to imagine it as anything more was to court the same heartbreak that had nearly destroyed her. So she kept a careful distance, a quiet reserve in her heart, even as her life became inextricably woven with his. The autumn days grew shorter, the nights colder. They worked hard, preparing the ranch for the coming winter, reinforcing the stable, and stockpiling feed and firewood. Annabeth pushed herself relentlessly, eager to prove her worth, to show him his trust in her had not been misplaced. She ignored the weariness that settled deep in her bones, the slight tremor in her hands at the end of the day. One evening, a chilling rain began to fall, and the temperature plummeted. Annabeth came inside, soaked through and shivering, a deep ache settling into her joints. She dismissed it as simple fatigue, but by the time she lay down on her cot, her teeth were chattering uncontrollably. A fiery heat began to bloom behind her eyes, and the simple cabin began to tilt and sway. She must have cried out. The next thing she knew, Elias was kneeling beside her, the light from the oil lamp casting his concerned face in flickering shadows. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, and his touch, rough as it was, felt blessedly cool against her burning skin. "You've got a fever," he said, his voice low and serious. "A bad one." The night became a blur of disjointed images and sensations. She was aware of him forcing sips of cool water between her chapped lips. She felt him bathing her face and wrists with a damp cloth. The fever dreams came, pulling her back to the fire. The suffocating smoke, the searing pain. She tossed and turned, tangled in her blankets, a low whimper escaping her throat. At some point, the shivering became violent, shaking her entire body. She was so cold, a deep cellular cold that no number of blankets could seem to touch. Through the fog of her illness, she felt the cot dip as Elias lay down on the edge of it. Outside the covers, he gently pulled her onto her side, so her back was to him. Then, he drew the heavy wool blankets over both of them. His body was a wall of solid warmth behind her. He shifted, and his arm came around her, settling over her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He was careful, his touch respectful, but his intent was clear, to share his own body heat, to fight the chill that was consuming her. The initial shock of his closeness was a jolt through her system. No man had held her like this, not ever. Her whole body went rigid, but the fever was a merciless thief, stealing her strength, her will, her carefully guarded defenses, and the warmth was undeniable. It seeped through her thin nightdress, a slow, steady tide pushing back the icy cold. It was more than just physical heat. It was the profound, elemental comfort of another human presence in the terrifying darkness of her illness. It was safety. It was care. Slowly, involuntarily, her body began to relax into his. The rigid line of her spine softened. The violent shivers subsided into a faint tremor. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her back, a calm and constant anchor in the swirling chaos of the fever. His breath was warm on the back of her neck. He held her like that for hours, still and silent, a guardian against the night. And in the deep, protected space of that simple, selfless embrace, something inside Annabeth broke. A single hot tear escaped the corner of her eye, tracing a path through the grime on her temple. Then another and another. Soon, a silent, wrenching sob shook her frame, a flood of grief she had held back for 5 long years. She wept for her parents. She wept for the face she had lost. She wept for the girl who had been left at the altar. And she wept for the profound, aching loneliness that had been her only companion. She cried in her sleep, her defenses washed away by fever and an act of kindness so pure it pierced her straight to the soul. For the first time, she allowed herself to be weak, to be cared for, and in the arms of the quiet cowboy. She was not consumed by it. She was only held. The fever broke like a storm, leaving behind a strange and fragile quiet. Annabeth awoke to the pale light of dawn, her body weak and drenched in sweat, but her mind blessedly clear. The cold had receded, replaced by a profound weariness. She was tucked into her own cot, sometime during the night. Elias had moved back to his. A fresh bucket of water sat beside her, and the scent of coffee was just beginning to permeate the small cabin. But the comfortable silence that had once defined their days was gone. In its place was a taut, humming awareness. The single room, which had felt like a shared sanctuary, now seemed charged with the memory of his warmth, the steady beat of his heart against her back, the secure weight of his arm around her. The intimacy of that night, born of necessity, had irrevocably altered the landscape between them. Annabeth avoided his eyes. She busied herself with simple tasks, her movements slow and deliberate. Elias, too, seemed uncertain. He was clumsier than usual, his large hands fumbling as he poured her a cup of coffee. The air was thick with unspoken words. The easy rhythm of their partnership had been disrupted, and neither of them knew the steps to a new dance. She tried to rebuild the walls that the fever had washed away. She worked with a quiet, desperate fervor, as if to prove she was still just his hired help. She scrubbed the floors with more vigor, mended his shirts with smaller, tighter stitches, and answered his questions with a formal "yes, sir" or "no, sir" that had not been part of their vocabulary before. She was trying to turn back time, to retreat to the safety of their simple arrangement. Elias, however, did not retreat. He seemed to understand that the old ground was lost forever, and instead of trying to reclaim it, he began to cautiously build something new. He did not press her or acknowledge the awkwardness between them directly. Instead, he began to talk. He began to fill the silence not with idle chatter, but with pieces of himself. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he spoke of his wife. He had mentioned her before, but only in passing. This time, he said her name, Sarah, and the name hung in the air between them, imbued with love and loss. "Sarah, she would have liked your garden," he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "She could make anything grow. Said she had a special understanding with the earth." He was quiet for a long moment. "She was like sunshine, the kind that warms you right through to the bone. When she was gone, it felt like the sun had just gone out, and it's been cold ever since." He spoke of the emptiness of the cabin after she died, of the crushing silence, of waking in the night and reaching for someone who wasn't there. He wasn't asking for pity. He was simply bearing witness to his own pain, and in doing so, he was offering Annabeth a profound gift, the knowledge that she was not the only one in this cabin haunted by ghosts. His vulnerability was a constant, gentle pressure against her defenses. She felt herself softening, her resolve wavering, and it terrified her. She fought back with the only weapon she had, self-deprecation. She felt unworthy of his confidence, of his kindness. One afternoon, he found her struggling to lift a heavy sack of feed. He took it from her easily, his brow furrowed with concern. "You're not fully recovered. Annabeth, you need to rest." "I'm fine," she insisted, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'm here to work. Mr. Thorne, not to be a burden." The look on his face was one of such deep hurt that she immediately regretted her words. "A burden," he said, his voice low. "You have never been a burden." He thought she was pushing him away, and in a way, she was pushing away the hope he represented, because hope was a far more dangerous thing than despair. Despair was a familiar ache, a state she had learned to survive. Hope could shatter you. She had been shattered by it once before, in a sunlit church, and she would not survive it again. The tension between them culminated on a night when the moon was a perfect, silver disk in a cloudless sky. It hung so bright and heavy it seemed to be dripping light onto the stark landscape, bathing the world in a soft, ethereal glow. The horses are restless, Elias said, standing in the doorway of the cabin. A ride might settle them, and us. Annabeth agreed, drawn by the strange magic of the night. They saddled their horses and rode out, not speaking, the only sound the soft thud of hooves on the dry earth. He led them to a place she hadn't seen before, a small, hidden lake, nestled in a depression between two low hills. The water was as still and black as glass, and the moon lay perfectly on its surface, a circle of pure, shattered silver. The beauty of it was so profound it ached in her chest. They dismounted and stood by the water's edge. The air was cool and crisp, and the silence was absolute. Elias finally broke it, his voice a low whisper, as if not to disturb the sanctity of the place. "I look at you, Annabeth," he began, his eyes on the water, "and I don't see what you think I see. I see strength. I see a woman who has been through hellfire and is still standing. I see a gentleness you try so hard to hide." He turned to face her, and in the moonlight, his eyes were dark pools of sincerity. This ranch, it was just a place to exist, to pass the days until they were done. Since you came, it started to feel like a place to live again. He took a hesitant step closer. "I know our arrangement was for work, but it's become more than that for me, and I'm hoping it has for you, too." He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them before he let it fall back to his side. "If I had the right, if I were allowed to ask, I'd ask you to stay. Not for the work, Annabeth, for you." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was everything she had secretly, foolishly, allowed herself to dream of, and it was her worst nightmare. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was the hope that would break her. This was the precipice of a fall she could not survive. A choked sound escaped her lips.
I can't.
Before he could say another word, she turned and scrambled onto her horse. She dug her heels into its sides, and the startled animal leaped forward, carrying her away from the beautiful, terrible lake, away from the man whose gentle words threatened to destroy what little was left of her. She fled back to the ranch, her own ragged sobs lost in the sound of the wind and the frantic beat of the horse's hooves. Back in the cabin, she paced the floor like a caged animal. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and self-loathing. Asterisk. He pities you. He's lonely. He would say this to any woman. You are scarred. You are broken. You are not worthy of a good man's love. She could not stay. She could not watch this fragile hope bloom, only to have it wither and die when he finally saw her for what she truly was, a damaged, incomplete woman. It would be kinder to leave now, to cut it clean. By the flickering light of a single candle, she took out a piece of paper and a stub of pencil. Her hands trembled as she wrote, Asterisk, Mr. Thorne. Asterisk. Thank you for your kindness. You gave me shelter when I had none, and I will be forever grateful. But I cannot stay. You deserve a whole woman, one who can give you the happiness you have been denied. I am not that woman. Please do not try to find me. Asterisk yours, Annabeth. She left the note on the small table, packed her meager belongings into her carpet bag, and lay on her cot, fully dressed, to wait for the first hint of dawn. She must have dozed off. She was startled awake by a hand on her shoulder. Elias was standing over her, the first gray light of morning silhouetting his large frame. In his other hand, he held her letter. His face was a mask of anguish. You weren't even going to say goodbye? He asked, his voice thick with a pain that tore at her. She sat up, pulling away from his touch. It was better this way, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. Better for who, Annabeth? He demanded, his voice rising with a desperate edge. For you to run, for me to wake up and find you gone, like a ghost after everything? You don't understand, she cried, finally looking at him, her own tears blurring his image. Look at me! How can you want this? Her hand gestured wildly to her scarred cheek. He didn't answer with words. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, knelt before her, and gathered her into his arms. It was not a gentle embrace like the one in her sickbed. This one was desperate, urgent, a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. He buried his face in her hair, his whole body trembling. She felt the dampness of his own tears on her neck. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently stroking her unscarred skin. His eyes, full of a sorrow that mirrored her own, held hers captive. "If you leave," he said, his voice breaking on a ragged whisper, "I'll have nothing left to hold on to." Elias's words, raw and broken, were a tether that stopped her from drifting away into the cold sea of her own fear. "I'll have nothing left to hold on to." He was not offering her pity. He was offering her his own broken pieces, admitting that hers somehow made his whole. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls she had hidden behind for 5 years didn't just crack. They crumbled into dust. She didn't run. She stayed. But the dawn that followed was not one of easy resolution. A fragile truce settled over the cabin, heavy with the weight of confessions made in the pale, pre-dawn light. They moved around each other with a new, shy tenderness, like 2 people learning the shape of a strange and precious object. The air between them thrummed with a current of unspoken possibility, both terrifying and beautiful. The sky that day seemed to reflect their inner turmoil. By midday, the horizon to the west had turned a sickly, bruised yellow. The perpetual wind, usually a steady moan, fell eerily silent. The horses in the corral grew skittish, their ears twitching, their eyes wide and rolling as they stared at the approaching discoloration in the sky. "A duster," Elias said, his voice grim as he stood on the porch, his hand shielding his eyes. "And a bad one, by the looks of it. We need to get the animals into the barn. Now." There was no time for hesitation. They worked with a frantic, synchronized urgency, their earlier awkwardness forgotten in the face of a greater threat. They herded the nervous horses into the relative safety of the large, sturdy barn that stood a short distance from the cabin. Annabeth secured the chickens in their coop, while Elias battened down anything loose in the yard that could become a deadly projectile. The storm hit not with the roar of thunder, but with a low, sinister hiss that grew into a deafening, abrasive roar. It was a solid wall of moving earth, a churning brown tide that swallowed the sun and plunged the world into a gritty, suffocating twilight. The wind screamed like a banshee, throwing fistfuls of sand and gravel against the wooden walls of the barn. It was impossible to see more than a few inches, impossible to breathe without covering one's mouth and nose. We can't make it back to the cabin," Elias yelled over the din, pulling the heavy barn door shut just as the full force of the storm slammed into it. He dropped the thick wooden bar into place, sealing them inside. The world outside ceased to exist. Their universe was now this cavernous, dim space, thick with the smell of hay, dust, and the warm, animal scent of frightened horses. The beasts stamped and snorted in their stalls, their fear a palpable thing in the enclosed space. The wind howled and shrieked, a relentless assault on the structure that held them. The walls groaned, and the roof timbers creaked under the immense pressure. Fine dust sifted down through the cracks, coating everything in a layer of fine, red powder. Fear, primal and sharp, coiled in Annabeth's stomach. They were trapped, a tiny island of fragile safety in a sea of raw, elemental fury. In the dim light filtering through the dusty cracks, she could see Elias's face, tense and alert, his gaze constantly moving, checking the strain on the beams, listening to the sounds of the storm. He moved closer to her, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the chaos. "It'll hold," he said, his voice low but steady, meant to soothe both her and the horses. This barn was built to withstand the worst of it. They found a relatively sheltered spot near a stack of hay bales and sat down, their shoulders nearly touching. The noise was immense, a physical force that vibrated through the floorboards and into their bones. There was nothing to do but wait it out, in the forced stillness, with the world being torn apart just outside the walls. All the emotions they had been holding at bay surged to the surface. The fear of the storm mingled with the fear in their hearts, amplifying everything. Annabeth shivered, though it wasn't from cold. She wrapped her arms around herself, her gaze distant. Elias watched her, his expression unreadable in the gloom. "Annabeth," he said, his voice barely audible over the gale. She turned to him. In the near darkness, his eyes seemed to hold a light of their own. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before they came to rest on her cheek. But he did not touch the smooth skin. His touch was on the scar. She flinched, a lifetime of shame and hurt rising up in a bitter wave. Her instinct was to pull away, to hide, but his touch was not one of curiosity or revulsion. It was impossibly gentle, a whisper of a touch, as if he were tracing the lines of a precious, fragile map. He followed the jagged, puckered ridge of skin from her temple down to her jaw, his gaze holding hers, full of a tenderness so profound it made her breath catch in her throat. "This," he murmured, his thumb stroking the ruined skin, "is not what I see when I look at you. This is just a part of your story. It's not the whole story." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, the world shrinking until it was only the space between them, the roar of the wind a distant echo. "Nothing," he whispered, his breath warm against her lips, "could make me want you less." His words were the key that unlocked the final, rusted gate to her heart. The tears she shed were not of sorrow, but of a release so complete it felt like a rebirth. He was not looking past her scar. He was seeing it, accepting it, and loving her, not in spite of it, but with it. It was a part of her, and he wanted all of it. He kissed her then. It was a kiss that began with a gentle, questioning pressure and deepened as she responded with all the pent-up hunger and longing of a woman starved of tenderness. It was a desperate, healing kiss, a communication that went far beyond words. It spoke of shared pain, of a profound recognition of the wounds, both visible and invisible, that they each carried. In the shelter of the screaming storm, surrounded by the scent of hay and the nervous energy of the horses, they came together. It was an act of fierce and desperate beauty, a reclamation of all that had been lost. For Annabeth, it was the shedding of a skin of shame she had worn for 5 long years. In his arms, she was not a disfigured object of pity. She was a desirable woman, cherished and wanted. His hands and lips mapped her body with a reverence that healed as it aroused, and she met his passion with a fervor that surprised them both, a passionate affirmation of life in the face of the storm's fury. They found in each other a solace and a fire that pushed back the darkness, both outside and within. When the storm finally passed, it was as if the world had been scrubbed clean. Annabeth awoke in Elias's arms, nestled in a makeshift bed in the hayloft, to silence. The only sound was the gentle breathing of the horses below. A single, brilliant shaft of sunlight pierced the gloom through a high crack in the wall, illuminating a swirl of dancing dust motes. It was over. The walk back to the cabin was through a landscape transformed, coated in a fresh layer of red dust that softened all the hard edges. Inside, Elias quietly started a fire and put a pot of coffee on to brew while Annabeth washed her face, her movements slow, her body aching in a new and wonderful way. When she looked in the small, cracked mirror, she saw the same face, the same scar. But for the first time, she did not flinch. She saw a woman who had been loved. And when she turned and saw Elias watching her from across the room, his expression full of a deep, quiet adoration, she smiled. It was a small, hesitant curve of her lips, but it was a real smile, and it reached all the way to her eyes. The peace of that morning was a fragile, perfect thing. It lasted until an hour after sunrise. A rider appeared on the horizon, a dark speck moving steadily toward them. It was not the gait of a neighbor or a lost traveler. There was an arrogance in the way the man sat his horse, a purposefulness that set Annabeth's teeth on edge. As he drew closer, a cold dread washed over her, so intense it nearly buckled her knees. She knew that rider. He reined his horse to a halt in front of the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the scene with a proprietary air. He was handsome, in a cruel, sharp-featured way, and dressed in clothes that were too fine for this rough country. It was Samuel, her former fiancé. "Annabeth," he said, his voice laced with a mocking disbelief. He swung down from his horse. "So this is the sty you've crawled into. I must admit, I didn't think you had the grit to survive out here." Elias stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself slightly in front of Annabeth. His face was a thundercloud. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice a low growl. Samuel's eyes flickered to Elias, dismissing him with a contemptuous sneer. "And who is this? Your keeper?" His gaze returned to Annabeth, cold and possessive. "I've come to take you back. You made a fool of me, running off like that. You owe me. You will come back, and you will learn your place." "She's not going anywhere with you," Elias said, his hands clenching into fists. "She is my property," Samuel snarled, his mask of civility dropping away to reveal the ugliness beneath. "We were betrothed. She belongs to me." He took a step toward the porch, his hand reaching for Annabeth. "Get your things. You've had your little adventure." Elias moved in a blur, shoving Samuel back so hard he stumbled. "Get off my land!" Samuel was faster than he looked. He recovered his balance and lunged, but not at Elias's fists. He had a small, heavy club, a blackjack, tucked into his belt. He swung it in a vicious arc, catching Elias on the side of the head. Elias staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before a second blow brought him to his knees. "Elias!" Annabeth screamed, rushing forward. Samuel grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "You see?" he hissed in her ear, his face twisted with triumph as he looked down at the groaning man on the ground. "This is what happens when you forget who you belong to. Now, you're coming with me." The past she had run from had not just found her. It had knocked down her door and stood over her, ready to drag her back into the dark. The scream that tore from Annabeth's throat was not one of fear, but of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a sound so raw and primal that it startled Samuel, his grip on her arm momentarily slackening. In that instant, she twisted away from him, dropping to her knees beside Elias. He was conscious, groaning as he tried to push himself up, one hand pressed to the side of his head where blood was already matting his dark hair. "Don't you touch him again!" Annabeth snarled, turning on Samuel with a fury that made him take an involuntary step back. The timid, broken girl he had known was gone, and in her place was a woman forged in fire, her eyes blazing with a protective inferno. Samuel smirked, regaining his composure. "He's not worth the trouble. I'll be in town. You have until sundown tomorrow to be packed and waiting. If you are not, I will come back here, and I will burn this place to the ground with him inside it." He swung himself onto his horse, his eyes locking onto hers with a look of chilling possession. "You are mine, Annabeth. You will learn that," with a final, contemptuous glance at the man on the ground. He wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. Annabeth wasted no time on the threat. Her focus was entirely on Elias. "Let me help you," she said, her voice softening as she put her arm around his broad shoulders. He leaned on her heavily, and with a grunt of pain, he allowed her to guide him into the cabin and onto his cot. The gash on his temple was deep and ugly. Her hands, which had trembled with fear only hours before, were now steady as she fetched clean water and strips of linen. She washed the wound with a gentle, focused care, her touch feather-light. He winced as she cleaned away the blood, but his eyes never left her face. "Annabeth," he rasped, his hand coming up to cover hers where it rested on his forehead. "You should go. He's a dangerous man. Take a horse, ride west. Don't look back. His words, meant to protect her, felt like a slap. Run? Again? Hide in the shadows, waiting for the past to find her once more? As she tied the bandage around his head, her mind flashed back. Not to the fire, but to a spring afternoon in Ohio, a year before it. She and Samuel had been walking by the river. Her father had just agreed to their betrothal. "Your father's farm is one of the most prosperous in the county," Samuel had said, his tone more that of a businessman than a suitor. "The land is rich. Joining our families will create a formidable holding." She had felt a small chill then, a sense that he was not courting her, but her inheritance. He had never spoken of a future with children, of a home filled with laughter. He had spoken of ledgers, of acreage, of status. He had never loved her. He had only ever wanted to possess what she represented. And when the fire had taken her parents, her home, and her face, her value in his eyes had turned to ash. He hadn't been heartbroken by her tragedy. He had been inconvenienced by it. She looked down at Elias, at the man who had held her through a fever, who had seen her scar and called her strong, who had offered her not a transaction, but his own wounded heart. Running was not an option. It was a betrayal of him, and a betrayal of the woman he was helping her become. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I am not running, not this time." Leaving him with a cup of water and a promise to return, she strode out of the cabin, saddled one of the horses with a determined efficiency, and rode for Larkspur Hollow. She would not wait for Samuel's deadline. She would face him now. The town felt different this time. Before, she had sought its anonymity. Now, she felt its collective gaze as a challenge. The whispers started as soon as she rode down the main street. Samuel had clearly been busy. He was sitting on the porch of the saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching her approach with an arrogant, knowing smile. He had already told his version of the story, the tale of a hysterical, ungrateful fiancée who had run from her duties. She ignored him, dismounting in front of the sheriff's office and tying her horse to the rail. The sheriff, a portly man named Brody with a weary face and a stained vest, listened to her story with a distinct lack of interest. His chair tilted back against the wall. "So you're saying this fella, your fiancé, came to collect you?" he asked when she finished, his tone bored. "He is not my fiancé," Annabeth insisted. "He broke our betrothal. He threatened us. He assaulted Mr. Thorne." Sheriff Brody sighed and let his chair thump down onto all four legs. "Ma'am, do you have a marriage license? Any legal papers to that effect?" "No, we were only betrothed, but he broke it." "So it's his word against yours." The sheriff interrupted. "Mr. Jennings, that's his name, right? He came to me this morning, said you were his intended, that you'd had a fright and run off. Seemed a respectable enough gentleman. Far as the law is concerned, this is a domestic dispute. I can't get involved." "He struck a man with a weapon." "A squabble over a woman," Brody said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Happens all the time. Best you sort it out amongst yourselves." Annabeth stood there, stunned. The law, the supposed bastion of order and protection, was a closed door. She was a woman with a scarred face and a complicated story. Samuel was a well-dressed man with a simple, believable one. In the eyes of the world, she was the unstable one, her disfigurement a physical manifestation of her supposed flaws. She walked out of the sheriff's office and into the harsh afternoon sun, feeling the weight of the town's judgment settle on her shoulders. People stopped to stare. Women pulled their children a little closer. Her scar, she realized, was not just a mark on her skin. In their eyes, it was a brand on her soul, a sign of damnation, the mark of a woman who was cursed or impure. She saw Samuel watching her from the saloon, his smile widening. He lifted his glass in a mock toast. He had won. The law, society, prejudice, it was all on his side. In that moment, something inside her snapped. It was the last thread of fear, the last vestige of the victim she had allowed herself to be. She would not be silenced. She would not be dismissed. If they would not listen to her in private, she would make them listen in public. She walked to the center of the street, right in front of the general store where a small crowd of people were milling about. She took a deep breath, and she began to speak.
My name is Annabeth,
she said, her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength with every word. It cut through the low hum of the town, and people began to turn.
That man.
She pointed a steady finger toward Samuel, who was now rising from his chair, his expression turning from amusement to fury. Is Samuel Jennings. He has told you I am his fiancé. He has told you he came here to bring me home. Samuel started walking toward her. Annabeth, that's enough. You're making a scene.
He broke our betrothal,
she continued, her voice rising, ignoring him.
He broke it on our wedding day, in front of the whole church, because he could not bear to look at this.
She raised her hand and gestured to her scarred cheek, turning her head so everyone could see it clearly. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers.
But I want you to know how I came by this mark,
she said, her voice ringing with a new and powerful clarity.
It was not a curse. It was not a punishment. It was a choice.
Her mind flew back to that night of smoke and terror. There was a fire. My parents were trapped. But before the roof fell, I had a chance to save my little sister, Lily. A burning beam fell between us. To get to her, I had to go through the flames. Tears streamed down her face now, but they were tears of love, not of self-pity. This mark is the price I paid to save my sister's life. I would pay it again, 1,000 times over. It is not a mark of shame. The crowd was utterly silent, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The whispers died. The judgmental stares softened. She had taken their greatest weapon, her own disfigurement, and turned it into a shield of honor. Samuel stood frozen, his face pale. This was not the story he had told. A figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. It was Mrs. Gable from the boarding house. She looked at Annabeth, and for the first time, Annabeth saw not a hard-faced taskmaster, but a woman, Mrs. Gable gave a slow, deliberate nod of support. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. Just then, another figure pushed his way through the stunned onlookers. It was Elias. He was pale and unsteady, the white bandage a stark contrast against his dark hair, but his eyes were blazing. He walked until he was standing right beside Annabeth, his shoulder brushing against hers, a silent, unshakable pillar of support. He looked at the crowd, then at Samuel, his voice low and clear. This woman's honor is not for sale, and it is not for debate. She will not be threatened. We will live our lives, and we will live them right, no matter who stands against it. The sight of them together, the scarred woman and the wounded man, standing defiant against the world, broke the spell. Sheriff Brody, seeing the tide of public opinion turning, bustled out of his office. He could no longer call it a domestic dispute. It was now a public disturbance. He faced Samuel. "Mr. Jennings," he said, his voice now full of official authority. "This town has had enough of your trouble. I suggest you get on your horse and ride. And don't come back." Samuel looked from the sheriff's hard face to the hostile eyes of the townspeople, and finally to Annabeth and Elias, standing together, unbreakable, defeated, his face a mask of pure hatred. He turned without a word, mounted his horse, and galloped out of town, leaving nothing behind but the dust settling in the street. The ride back to the ranch was a world away from Annabeth's desperate flight to town. They rode side by side, the silence between them no longer fraught with tension or uncertainty, but filled with a deep and abiding peace. The dust of Samuel's departure had settled, and in its place, a new reality was taking root. As they passed through the edge of Larkspur Hollow, the stares they received were different. The open contempt was gone. replaced by a grudging respect in some eyes, and a veiled, gossipy curiosity in others. They had become a story, a piece of the town's lore. On the hitching post outside the boarding house, a covered basket was waiting for them. Inside was a fresh loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a jar of preserves. There was no note, but Annabeth knew it was from Mrs. Gable. It was a quiet signal of support, an acknowledgement that their stand had been seen and, by some, honored. Back at the ranch, the quiet rhythm of life resumed, but its melody had changed. It was slower now, more deliberate. The frantic edge of survival was gone, replaced by the steady, purposeful work of building a future. They were no longer just two wounded souls sharing a roof. They were partners, laying the foundation for a life, stone by stone. They worked on the land, their hands in the same soil. They expanded the small garden, their conversations meandering as they planted rows of winter vegetables. Elias started construction on a new, larger stable, and Annabeth worked alongside him, learning to measure boards, drive nails, and appreciate the clean, sharp scent of freshly sawn pine. Her laughter, once as rare as a desert rose, became a more frequent sound, often prompted by a clumsy horse or a shared, simple joke. The cabin, once just a shelter, began to feel like a home. One afternoon, a wagon from the town's small church made the long journey out to their ranch. It carried Reverend Michael, a young, earnest man, and 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, whose quiet eyes held the familiar, haunted look of orphans. The town, having no formal orphanage, relied on the charity of its citizens. The Reverend, having heard the story of their courage, had a proposition. "These children, they've seen too much hardship," he explained. "They need something to connect with, something to care for. I was hoping perhaps you could teach them to ride, to be around the horses." Elias looked at Annabeth, a silent question in his eyes. She saw the children shrink from her gaze, their eyes darting to her scar. The old, familiar sting of rejection pricked at her, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of empathy. She knelt down. So she was at their level. "My name is Annabeth," she said, her voice soft. "This mark on my face came from a fire. I got it while pulling my little sister to safety." She saw a flicker of understanding in a young girl's eyes. "Horses don't care what a person looks like. They only care if you're kind. Would you like to learn how to be kind to a horse?" The girl gave a shy, hesitant nod, and so began a new chapter. Twice a week, the children would come to the ranch, under Elias's patient guidance and Annabeth's gentle encouragement. They learned to groom the animals, to speak to them in low, soothing tones, and eventually, to ride. The ranch, once a bastion of solitude, now echoed with the tentative laughter of children. It became a place of healing, not just for Annabeth and Elias, but for the other lost souls who found their way there. As the days shortened and the nights grew crisp with the promise of winter, Annabeth felt a deep, settled peace she had never believed possible. But one piece of their life remained unspoken, undefined. They were partners in every way that mattered. But the world had its own rules, its own labels. One evening, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, she made a decision. "Elias," she said, her voice quiet in the vast darkness of the porch, "will you ride with me?" She led him not on a new path, but back to an old one, the trail that led to the small, hidden lake where he had first confessed his feelings. The moon was a perfect sliver this time, casting a more subtle, intimate light on the water. The place was no longer charged with her fear, but imbued with the memory of a turning point. They stood by the shore, the same cool air, the same profound silence, but this time, it was she who broke it. "Do you remember what you said to me? Here?" she asked, her gaze on the reflection of the stars in the water. "I remember," he said, his voice a low rumble. She turned to face him, her heart beating a steady, confident rhythm.
You offered me a reason to stay. You offered me, Now I want to offer you something in return." She took his large, calloused hands in her own. "The world demands papers and preachers to make a union real. Men like Samuel think a promise in a church makes a woman his property. I don't believe in that. I believe in this." She squeezed his hands. "I believe in the life we've built, in the silences we share, in the home we have made. All I need is your word, here, under these stars. Will you have me, Elias Thorne? Will you be my husband?" The look on his face, a mixture of profound shock, awe, and a love so deep it took her breath away, was all the answer she needed. He couldn't speak. He simply pulled her to him, his kiss a powerful, reverent answer. Later, they built a small fire near the water's edge. In its flickering, golden light, they spoke their own vows. There was no preacher, no congregation. There was only the moon, the stars, the crackling fire, and the truth in their hearts. "I promise," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he cupped her face in his hands, his thumb gently tracing her scar. "To always see you, Annabeth, all of you, and to be the man you believe I am." "And I promise," she whispered, her tears glistening in the firelight, "to never run again, to stand by your side. My heart is your home. Elias, it always will be." Their words sealed it. They were a vow of partnership, a pact of two souls who had found their harbor in each other. That night, their passion was not born of desperation or the chaos of a storm. It was a joyful, deliberate celebration of their love, a tender and profound union under the vast, watchful sky of the West. It was the consummation of a marriage made not by law, but by love. But the world they had shut out did not forget them. The story of their stand in town had spread, and with it, rumors and resentment. They were a curiosity, an affront to the established order. Elias was a quiet man, but he now lived with a woman who was not his wife, a scarred woman. At that, whispers in the saloon and over clotheslines began to poison the well. The threat, when it came, was not from a man with a club, but from a man with a ledger, Mr. Prescott, a land agent from the county seat and a stern, church-going man who held influence in town, paid them a visit. He did not dismount his horse, his manner cold and official. "Thorne," he said, his eyes flicking from Elias to Annabeth with clear disapproval. "Your patent on this land is provisional, as you know. It requires the holder to be of sound moral character and to be improving the homestead." "I've done nothing but improve it," Elias said, his voice dangerously level. "That is a matter of opinion," Prescott replied coolly. "The law frowns upon improper living arrangements. It has been brought to the county's attention that you are cohabitating with this woman without the sanction of marriage. Such a living arrangement could be deemed immoral, and it could be grounds for your claim to be revoked and offered to a more suitable family." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. It was an attack on everything they had built, their home, their sanctuary, their future. After Prescott left, a heavy silence fell over Elias. He stared out at the land he had poured his blood and sweat into, his face a mask of weary fury. He had fought outlaws in the wilderness, but he didn't know how to fight whispers and legal documents. Annabeth looked at his defeated posture, and she felt not fear, but a cold, clear resolve. She had found her voice in the dusty street of Larkspur Hollow. She would not let it be silenced now. She went to him, placing a hand on his arm. "They are using the law to punish us for being happy," she said, her voice ringing with the same conviction she'd had that day in town. "Then I will use the law to protect us." He looked at her, his eyes full of doubt. "How? We have no license, no preacher to speak for us." "Then I will go to the county courthouse," she declared, her chin held high. "I will tell our story to the judge. I will make them see the truth." She looked at the distant mountains, her gaze steady and unafraid. "I will do it. Elias, even if I have to go alone."
The journey to the county seat was a 2-day ride by stagecoach, and the world seemed determined to stand in her way. Elias, his head still bandaged and his movements stiff, had pleaded with her to wait, to let him go in her stead. But Annabeth was resolute. This was her fight. It was her past that had brought this trouble, and it would be her voice that ended it. She accepted only one thing from him: his finest, steadiest horse, Titan, for the journey to the stagecoach stop. Her troubles began before she even reached the main road. A massive, ancient cottonwood had fallen across the narrow canyon trail, blocking it completely. It was too large to move, too dense to go around. It could have been an act of nature, a consequence of the recent storms. But as she stood there, a cold certainty settled in her heart. This was no accident. This was a message. Prescott, or men loyal to him, wanted to stop her. Frustration gave way to a flinty resolve. She would not be deterred. Leaving the stagecoach road behind, she urged Titan onto a lesser-known horse trail that snaked through the high country. It would add at least a day to her journey, but it was her only choice. The higher she climbed, the colder the air became. The sky, a clear, crisp blue that morning, took on a milky, hazy quality. By the second day, the world had turned gray and silent. Then, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were large and wet at first, melting on Titan's dark coat. But soon they became smaller, harder, driven by a rising, whistling wind. Within an hour, she was riding into a full-blown blizzard. The trail vanished. The world became a swirling, disorienting vortex of white. The wind shrieked, tearing at her cloak and driving the icy snow into her face with the force of tiny needles. She dismounted, knowing it was too dangerous to ride, her hand gripping Titan's reins as she tried to lead him, her only anchor in the white chaos. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that seeped through her layers of wool, stealing the warmth from her bones. Hours passed. She had no idea if she was moving forward or in circles. Every rock, every twisted juniper looked the same. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak, pulling her down. Her feet were numb, her hands clumsy and useless. She stumbled, falling to her knees in a deep drift. The thought of just closing her eyes, of letting the soft, white silence take her, was a seductive whisper. It would be so easy to just stop. She was so tired. As her consciousness began to fade, a single image burned through the fog. Elias's face, his eyes full of anguish, whispering, "Asterisk, if you leave, I'll have nothing left to hold on to." She had made him a promise. She had promised not to run. With a cry that was torn from her throat by the wind, she forced herself to her feet. She would not die here. She would not leave him to face this alone. She took one more step, and then another, a desperate, staggering pilgrimage through the heart of the storm. Elias had known something was wrong. He had felt it in the unnatural stillness of the air after she left, in the too-perfect placement of the fallen tree he found when he rode out to check the trail. He had returned to the ranch, saddled his fastest mare, and set out on the high trail, his heart a cold knot of dread in his chest. He was a man of the land. He could read the sky. He knew the blizzard was coming, and he knew she was heading directly into it. He rode with a desperate, focused fury, pushing his horse to its limit. The storm hit him with the same blinding force, but he did not stop. He called her name over and over, his voice a raw shout that was immediately swallowed by the howling wind. He was searching for a ghost in a world of white. He found her by a miracle. His horse shied, and he saw it, a dark shape half buried in a snowdrift. It was Titan, standing over a small, still form. Elias leaped from his saddle, his legs sinking to his thighs in the snow. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands brushing the snow from her face. Her skin was as white as the drifts around them, her lips tinged with blue. For one terrible, heart-stopping moment, he thought he was too late. But then, her eyelids fluttered. "Elias?" she breathed, her voice a faint,
incredulous whisper. Relief so powerful it felt like a physical blow washed over him. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her from the snow's cold embrace and holding her tight against his chest, sharing his warmth, his life. He wrapped his own heavy coat around her, lifting her onto his horse and mounting behind her, cradling her like a precious, fragile child. They were two small figures, reunited in a vast, white wilderness. The snow, which had been an agent of death, now felt like a cleansing shroud, washing away the last of the fear, the last of the past, leaving only the pure, undeniable truth of their bond. They arrived at the county seat 2 days later, weary and frostbitten, but together. The judge, a formidable man named Abernathy, with eyes that seemed to see right through a person, listened to Prescott's cold, legalistic arguments. He spoke of moral failings, of an improper household, of the need to maintain community standards. Then it was Annabeth's turn. She stood before the judge, not as a defendant, but as a homesteader. She did not speak of love or romance. She spoke of the land. She spoke of mending fences and digging wells, of the new stable they had built and the garden that fed them. She spoke of the orphaned children who came to the ranch, who were learning not just to ride, but to trust again. "The law, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is concerned with improvements. We have taken a piece of hard, unforgiving land, and we are making it a home. We are making it a sanctuary. Is there a greater improvement than that? Is there a higher moral standard than taking in children who have no one?" And then Elias stepped forward, placing a small stack of papers on the judge's bench. They were sworn affidavits. One was from Mrs. Gable, testifying to Annabeth's character and work ethic. Another was from Reverend Michael, detailing the profound, positive effect the ranch was having on the orphans. The final one was a petition, signed by more than a dozen families in Larkspur Hollow, stating that Elias and Annabeth were good neighbors and an asset to the community. Judge Abernathy read each paper carefully. He looked at Prescott's smug face and then at the two people standing before him, the quiet, steady man and the woman whose face was scarred but whose spirit was unbreakable. "And Mr. Prescott," the judge said, his voice booming in the silent courtroom, "this court is not in the business of judging matters of the heart. It is in the business of judging matters of law. The law requires a homestead to be improved. By every account I have here, this homestead is not just being improved. It is flourishing. The claim stands. Case dismissed." The journey home was triumphant. As they rode into the basin where the ranch lay nestled, they were greeted by the sound of cheering. The 4 orphans, along with Reverend Michael, were waiting for them, their faces bright with joy. The West no longer seemed so harsh. It was a place where a person could build a life, could make a stand, and could, with enough grit and love, win. A week later, they were married, not in a church, but in the yard of their ranch, under the vast, open sky. Annabeth wore a simple blue dress, and in her hair, she had woven the wild flowers that grew stubbornly on the plains. Mrs. Gable was there, as was the Reverend and their small family of orphans. They spoke their vows again, not as whispers by a lake, but as proud, public declarations. Annabeth's life had come full circle, but she was not the same woman who had arrived in the West, cloaked in shame. She no longer hid her face. When new girls or women arrived in town, feeling lost or broken by the harshness of the frontier, they were often sent to the Thorn Ranch. Annabeth would sit with them, share a cup of coffee, and she would tell them her story. She would show them her scar, not as a warning, but as a testament, a symbol that survival was possible, that new beginnings could be forged in the fire, and that love could be found in the most unexpected of places. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and soft violet, she stood with Elias on a small rise overlooking their home. The wind, her old,
constant companion, swept across the prairie, tugging at her hair. She leaned her head against his shoulder, his arms securely around her. He was her anchor, her partner, her home. She looked out at the endless land, at the life they had built, at the future that stretched before them, bright and full of promise. She took a deep breath, the air clean and sweet.
"I'm not afraid anymore,"
she whispered. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and say hello. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales from the frontier, and share your thoughts on Annabeth and Elias's journey.